Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Fandom Frontline. Thank you all for joining me today for what's hopefully going to be a really fun and honestly really cathartic live stream. My full season review of Talamasca The Secret Order. We finally made it through all 6 episodes. The finale aired last night. And today I'm going to dissect the season from top to bottom, the good, the bad, the bewildering, and the occasionally brilliant. This will be a full deep dive, so grab a drink, settle in, and get comfy. Before we jump in, let me know in the chat. Did you enjoy the season? Did it disappoint you? You somewhere in the middle like I am? And yes, I will also be talking about where I think the show fits into the larger Immortal universe, especially as we move toward Interview with the Vampires adaptation of the Vampire Lestat next year. There's a lot to speculate about there. I'll be taking questions once I get to the end of my thoughts on the season, so let's get started. So I want to begin with something that's important to get on the table right away. This show had one of the richest possible premises any Anne Rice adaptation could ask for. Talamasca has always been a great mystery box of the Vampire Chronicles. They're watchers, archivists, a secret order that quietly observes the supernatural world. They're not flashy, they're not public, they quietly shape history from the margins. That alone, just that premise, could carry a show for years. You could build something that feels like the X Files for the supernatural Gothic, like Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy but with vampires, like a supernatural Cold War thriller with ancient conspiracies, breakaway factions, and moral dilemmas. And at its best moments, that's the show Talamasca wants to be. But at its worst, it feels like I can barely remember that premise exists. And that's the kind of bittersweet feeling I had all season. There's this constant sense of promise, this glimmer of something fascinating, and you can see it right there behind the curtain, but the show just keeps handing us the curtain instead of pulling it back. So let's talk about our lead, Guy Anatole. If you've been following my episode reviews, you already know where I stand. He's not an inherently bad character. The arc of the season just refused to develop it into a strong enough character to center the show around. He's supposed to be our audience proxy. Strongly smart but inexperienced, in and over his head, and making mistakes as he learns about the Talamasca. And this is totally fine in theory. The problem is that his perspective has yet to become compelling enough to anchor a narrative. If you're asking yourself after an entire season of 6 episodes, do I know what Guy wants? Do I know what drives him? Do I know what he's capable of? And the answer is still not really. That's a problem. The show leans hard on his confusion as a writing crutch. His constant bewilderment becomes the show's default tone. At its worst, it turns Guy into an emotional sponge for everyone else's exposition. At his best, he's a nice guy who means well and wants to find his mom. But that's not enough. Not for the protagonist of a show built around espionage and ambition and institutional power. At least not yet. Well, everyone in the chat, let me know. Did Guy work for you as a lead? Yes or no, and why? Drop your take and I'll read a few after this segment. But then we got to episode 4, and episode 4 was the moment the show really woke up. The episode was called Wet Work, and it suddenly remembers what the show was supposed to be: gothic, violent, mysterious, and actually spooky. We get revenant vampires, we get Raglan James popping in with charm and menace, we get action that feels alive, we get tension, we get aesthetic energy. And for just 1 hour of the show, it really works. This episode was the moment I sat up in my chair and said, oh, this is the show. This is what it could be every week. Characters move with purpose, the danger feels real, and the Talamasca's world feels big enough to explore. The episode proved that the bones of something great do exist here. The problem is that the show just kept forgetting how to use them. And by 2 episodes later, when we get the finale, the 752, the show finally answers just one question of note: who or what is the 752? And here's the twist: it's Doris herself. And even more of a twist than that, Doris could have ended up being the best thing about the show. Everything the season thought it was doing emotionally with Guy, Doris accomplishes in a single episode. Her backstory is genuinely tragic in that classic mournful Anne Rice way. She was taken as a child, used for her perfect memory, made into a living archive, transformed into a vampire to preserve her forever, hidden, exploited, and shaped by an institution that saw her as a tool. This is the story the show could have been telling from the very beginning. Celine Buckin's performance has depth, restraint, and internal struggle in this finale, everything the series needed. But the tragedy is, we don't get that until 5 minutes before the season ends. This is what I mean by disappointment born of potential. The show spent 5 episodes withholding the wrong mystery. We weren't just waiting for Guy to find the 752, we were waiting for him to be a character worth following. And Doris is suggested to be a character worth following just as much, and then the season is over. So we get to the final 10 minutes, and Talamasca does what streaming shows have often been doing when they want a renewal: it throws everything at the wall. Helen gets arrested, Guy and Doris flee, Jasper's rolled up in a rug and shipped like a cursed Amazon package in a rug. Houseman is introduced as an ominous new villain at the head of the Talamasca. Vampire armies are hinted at. The Talamasca structure is still completely opaque, and there's a billion unanswered questions. And this is the irony. For a show obsessed with mystery, almost none of the mysteries felt satisfying. So I want to ask you guys, did any cliffhangers actually hook you in the finale? Or did they all fall flat? Because for me, the only cliffhanger that really worked was the idea of Doris and Guy, a human spy who can read minds and a potentially all knowing vampire, on the run together. That's a show. That's a premise. It's a dynamic worth exploring. So after 6 episodes, here's where I land. Talamasca The Secret Order is not a bad show, but it feels like an unfinished one. A first draft. A blueprint or a sketch of what it could be. It has some ideas, some great ones, but in 6 episodes, it withheld effectively executing basically any of them. Pacing was uneven, and the protagonist has so far been misaligned with the show's actual strengths. The final result is a series that leaves more questions than satisfaction, but, and this is a surprising thing, I'm still invested because the bones are strong. Anne Rice's world is so rich and the mythology is compelling. Honestly, it's my fandom of her books and of the Interview with the Vampire TV series that really keep me invested in watching how these spin offs tie into it. The reveal of Doris as the 752 genuinely feels like a doorway to a better season. And of course, we do know where this franchise is ultimately headed next, the Vampire Lestat, next year. And I do believe this storyline of Guy and Doris and the Talamasca could become something much more compelling once it intersects with Lestat's orbit. Because that story will demand clarity, scale, and emotional focus, especially as other Talamasca characters from the books like David Talbot and Jesse Reeves or Cyprian Grieve from Mayfair Witches are brought in. So those are my thoughts on Talamasca The Secret Order. I'm going to leave it open for questions, but before getting into those, I'm going to read some details from an interview with showrunner John Lee Hancock that I found interesting and which may give us an idea of where things are headed. So, in this interview with the Hollywood Reporter, the first thing they pointed out was that the finale did have some great reveals. Audiences discovered that Doris isn't just Helen's sister, but both a vampire and the 752. Jasper is forcibly tasked with turning a bunch of people the way Doris was for the Talamasca. And so they asked John Lee Hancock, how did he reveal that the Doris twisted the cast, and what is Jasper feeling in that moment? They said, it was very hard during the casting process to keep it all under wraps because obviously that's a critical part, not just of Doris' story, but of Helen's story too. And they had to be a little bit coy. Until Celine was cast, they didn't want the word out to every single actress they interacted with. So it was a lot of generalities. You have a big secret, there's more to you than meets the eye. And then once they had the conversation with Celine when they did reveal it to her, then she had to keep it quiet. The crew didn't know. Doris had a huge secret, and so did Celine, the actress. And Celine was just bursting. When the script finally came out and then everybody knew, they all looked at Celine a little differently. And what's interesting about that, which they never really talked about, is that it served the purpose of filming the same way that it does in the story. Having nobody in the story know but her, they were all genuinely surprised and everything changed in their performance. It was nice to keep the cast in the dark. It's hard to do those things because everybody's brimming with questions, but ultimately Celine had a lot of fun with it. So then the Hollywood Reporter asked all season the talk of the book raised questions about whether a centuries old organization would potentially keep all that information in a printed and potentially destructible place or transfer it to something like a USB. There was also that moment with the body on the slab. Even the Hollywood Reporter interviewer said he felt like he'd seen that neck before, which raised a bunch of questions while watching about what was actually possible. And then the showrunner said that was another thing where they were like, how much hair do we show? Are people going to know? The bodies at the end with Jasper was something they had talked about and gone back and forth on. And Jasper said several times that he wants there to be more vampires in this world. Well, here's your wish, Jasper. Do you want this? And should we continue that story if given the chance? That's something the showrunners have been thinking a lot about. So then Abby White, the Hollywood Reporter journalist who was interviewing him, asked, when seeing all the bodies, she thought, oh, they collect children like weapons, but are they all the same? Just vessels for the 752. And at the end of Mayfair Witches season 2, a bunch of Teltos children were being swept away under the guise of saving them. Can we expect the Talamasca to only be dealing in certain abilities with the children of the larger supernatural creature communities? Whose bodies are those? And the showrunner said, here's what I'll say without spoiling anything. And all the questions you're asking are things they're talking about the writer's room. The Talamasca has, let's call it an R&D side. They are interested, as a mostly mortal organization, in trying to find ways in which to dig out latent abilities within people. That is what you see in season 1 with the institution. They found Doris and made Doris, But when we visit the other twin sisters, the ones Helen goes to see, they also have certain small bore abilities. What we're trying to suggest is that with the Talamasca, there's an effort they have had underway for some time to find these special people, grow them in house, and develop them. Who knows if in the future there might be other beings, people, or abilities we see on the screen? And so then the Hollywood Reporter interviewer, she asked, "We learned from Houseman there was a point in time when vampires had a key role in running Talamasca. I'm curious about whether or not there were other species, mortal or immortal, that were running the order, and if it will be explained either in your show or someone else's why the vampires are no longer there." And so they responded, "Part of the way we've imagined the Talamasca is that there are certain people like David Talbot, who is a vampire, and he's in the Talamasca. There's a little bit of a porousness there. One of the things we love is to think about is the Talamasca as an institution that has gotten away from its roots, and that if we are traveling down the road of when the Talamasca that was created, there was more of a balance in the supernatural world. It was created with the aiding and abetting of vampires, that somehow over time, the thing that was supposed to keep this balance got imbalanced. The mandate is still there to keep the balance in the supernatural world, but suddenly a bunch of mortals are running this thing, and they have an outsized amount of power and influence in this organization. The fun of it for us is to say that Talamasca is largely good, and yet it has traveled far away from where it started and its roots. Interview mostly focuses on vampires and Mayfair on witches, and now we're finding ourselves in the heart of this organization that has a problem at its core and has to maybe think about what it believes and what it's supposed to be doing. Later in the interview, she asks, "Helen is compromised within the Talamasca, but we learn for the good of something, and that makes her genuine and trustworthy, even if she can't always be fully honest. So she takes the fall for Doris, helping her twin and Guy escape, and that leads to an officer revealing she knows Helen couldn't have committed any murder she's accused of. So where does Helen go now? Does she continue to work towards uncovering more about the nature of what was happening to her and her sister, especially after that deadly confrontation where she somehow avoided being shot?" And so Hancock said, "Thanks for pointing that out about Helen. I think it's both the character and also the humanity that Elizabeth McGovern brings and imbues that character with not only likable traits, but a degree of trustworthiness. Which is ironic given the fact that she works within the Talamasca and deals in lies and half truths. And we know where we leave Helen. I do think that she likes to think of herself as a good person trying to do the right thing, and holds the Talamasca in her mind as an organization that should be trying to do the right thing and protect the equilibrium between the natural and supernatural worlds. I also think that she has, from childhood, if you were to call it a cult, been in it forever. So there's a part of that that's difficult to dismiss and cut away from. That said, at the end of the finale, she is definitely on the outs with the Talamasca, and there's a whole lot to deal with, both on her personal front with Guy and the larger story. And while Ridge, the detective, strongly suspects that Helen could not have committed this murder, I don't know that Ridge is in a place where she can just let Helen out of her squad car, right? She's got to go to jail. So Helen is not scot free when we leave the season at all. She's in a pickle, and she'll have to get out of that pickle. Oh, and then they talk about Jasper after this. So the Hollywood Reporter interviewer, she asks, "Jasper was creating these revenants, which viewers have seen before in Interview with the Vampire. Their lore is interesting in how they expand the diversity of the vampire community. We also discover that Jasper was part of a mixed species family or community, but Interview with the Vampire has mostly shown vampires as having an almost disdain for humans. Jasper's backstory implies something else. What did you want to say about the vampire communities that viewers might not have already known? And can the existence of Jasper's interspecies family apply to other beings, mortal, immortal, that we see in the larger universe?" And so the showrunner said, "It's vital to us that Jasper come from a blended family like his old coven. Instead of making him into a hard mustache twisting villain, we wanted him to come from some interesting diversity and to have a story that had depth and humanity. Humanity is a strange way to put it since he's a vampire, but he was human for a lot longer than many people who are humans before they become a vampire. So he has a facility with both worlds. What I love is that the more you hear about Jasper, the more you go, I don't know if I agree with what you're doing, but I kind of understand you. He is crafty and has an emotional way, not just with vampires, but with humans. He understands both sides, and that makes him smart. It also makes him dangerous as we think about where the story might go in the future, and that's something we would want to extrapolate to see where somebody like that with that skill set and that emotional intelligence can wind up. He's pretty fun to think about in terms of story and very fun to write. Bill Fichtner is just amazing. Bill jumped in and grabbed Jasper and ran away with him. He's not some fancy ancient, he's a vampire of the people, and that's what we love about him. He has a better grip on the realities of the world than a lot of vampires cloistered away in their little sanitized places, wherever they are, including our show with Burton in his penthouse in the Dakota. Jasper's a man on the street, and this goes back to what we talked about. My way into writing vampires started with realizing, through what Anne Rice had written, that sometimes some of the vampires killed themselves, just in the pain of living forever, when others around you are constantly dying. How many funerals do you want to attend? The loneliness, sadness, and all those things are very human things you can write to. In Jasper, we created a character you can write to and give human attributes to, mostly because he spent a whole lot of time as immortal because before he became immortal. Jasper looks at the vampire world, and if a vampire says, "You don't understand, this is how we've always done things," he says, "I don't care, why?" When he looks at the human world at the Talamasca, they say, "This is how we've always done things," and he goes, "I don't care, why?" He doesn't want to do all the old ways everyone is talking about. He's going to wear a t shirt and walk around barefoot. He's just willing to buck the trends. He's willing to ask questions about everything in his path because he has the courage of his convictions and he's not willing to take anything as a given. So then the Hollywood Reporter pointed out that they featured a song from Lestat's band in the season and asked why did they include it and situate it where they did. And Hancock said that they're on a timeline with interview and they constantly try to be aware of that. If this is happening here, what time period is it for us? I will give Mark Lafferty the credit for thinking, what if? And then they point out that Roland Jones, the creator and showrunner of Interview with the Vampire, came into the writer's room. He had an office 10 feet from the Talamasca writing room for much of the season. And he came in at some point and said, "Can you guys play these songs? These are what we're thinking about doing for the next season of Interview with the Vampire." And so he played the writer's room some of the songs and said off the cuff, "If you guys want to think about digging one of these in at some point, do it." So the showrunners put it in their brains and they went away to shoot season one. And when they came back and they were in post, they brought back those songs. And of course, there are other things you're going to get echoes of from the other shows in this show. And it's not just crossover characters. It's more about something as inconsequential as a song being played, or the hotel in episode 4 being given a name that Interview with the Vampire is now going to use. And it may appear in an ad on a TV in the background of their show. It'll be these 6 vampire owned hotels and they're being advertised. Just the ingraining back and forth between the different TV shows. And then finally, the Hollywood Reporter asked one last question. This is the big one. We know some things are happening on these shows in parallel, and audiences know what books Interview is leaning into for season 3, and that would be the Vampire Lestat. Without implying too heavily what these other shows are fully feeding, might Talamasca the Secret Order season 1 do any setup for both Interview with the Vampire and Mayfair Witches next seasons? Can we expect any of their locations to house Guy's mother? Where is the crew going? And so Hancock said, "We hope we can continue the story. We don't know if we'll be continuing into season 2 yet, but we have strong aspirations and desires to. I would say all the questions you're asking that we cannot answer because we will trip over our shoelaces and give too much away are the right questions. There has to be an answer to Guy's search for his mom, but we will get ourselves into trouble if we say much more. So get on the phone and say, I want season 2." And so that was the interview. I can't even necessarily say that I want season 2 that badly, but if we get one, I hope it's better. I hope it improves on the interesting ideas we got in this first season. More importantly, I just hope that it expands on the more central story that we're getting in Interview with the Vampire and Mayfair Witches, the story that's actually telling the main storyline from the books. So now it's time to get into questions. Drop any questions you might have about the season, favorite moments, biggest frustrations, the finale, how it ties into the Immortal universe, or how it just set us up for the Vampire Lestat next year. I do have some questions here already, so I'm going to start answering them now. What worked best about the season's storytelling and what didn't work at all? Well, I think the basic idea of the main characters is good enough, so that works for the storytelling. The problem is it didn't do enough with them. I think the idea of the 752 and Doris is really great. It's just that they waited way too long to reveal it because they only had a 6 episode season. And now the season's over and we didn't get what probably would have been the core of an interesting TV show. It's a similar thing with Guy. He could have been an interesting protagonist, but he never got there. Someone asked, was the pacing consistent or did certain episodes drag or feel rushed? Well, I actually do have an answer to that. The first 3 episodes, the 2-part premiere, and then the episode after it, felt really slow, too slow. Then we finally got this almost big blow up of horror and blood and an interesting story in episode 4, Wet Work, only for them to suddenly start doing these unsatisfying reveals in the very next episode, and then the season was over in episode 6. So pacing was all over the place. Someone asked, does the finale feel earned or did it rely too heavily on cliffhangers? Nothing in the finale felt earned. It felt like the beginning of a TV show, honestly. I felt like everything in those 6 episodes could have been the pilot for Talamasca, and we might have had a better TV show to look forward to. Oh, someone asked if there was a moment where I kind of turned on the show one way or the other, where it clicked or fell apart. I would say it was almost back to back. Episode four, Wet Work, it was really clicking. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Then episode five starts giving us all these reveals, and I was like, really? That's it already? So episodes four and five are kind of the big turning points of the series. Someone asked me which character I think had the best arc. In some ways, Guy, only because he finally seems like he could be interesting at the very end. I don't know if we'll call that successful, but there it is. As far as someone else asked me if another characters felt underdeveloped, Olive. Olive was so underdeveloped that I almost forgot about her. That's Maisie Richardson Sellers' character. And keep in mind, I loved her in Legends of Tomorrow. I missed that actress. I'm glad to see her again. We learn nothing about her, and then we learn that she's a mole, and then she does very little again. So that was strange. Someone asked me if Guy works as a protagonist. I would say he can. He barely has yet, but he could. Someone asked if any side characters steal the spotlight. Yes, 1,000% yes. Jasper is definitely like the most fun to watch on screen. We didn't get too much of it, but when he was on screen, he was fascinating, and I really hope they do more with him. I will also say that even though she didn't get to do much throughout the season, the big reveal of Doris being the 752 means that she could be stealing the spotlight in the future. Which relationships are the strongest or weakest? I will say the kind of budding, like almost maternal relationship that Helen seems to have with Guy is really sweet and fascinating, and I hope they build on that. That feels like maybe a central relationship of the show. Meanwhile, the weakest relationship probably feels like the one between Guy and Doris, and I don't know what they're planning on that. I hope it doesn't get, heavily romantic. But it could, if they were to make it feel worthwhile, that could be something better than what it is. Someone asked whose performance stood out the most this season. I'd have to go back to Jasper for that. William Fichtner just did a great job as that character. Elizabeth McGovern also did a really good job as Helen. Nicholas Denton is fine as Guy. I don't have anything bad to say about him. I just think he was underwritten. So, I really do hope for more from all of these actors. I think they've got a great cast. They just need the writing to be there for them. Someone asked if the tone was consistent from episode to episode. Yeah, that's a great question because no, it was not. I honestly could not tell someone what to expect from this show in terms of tone and genre. You almost have to just take it as a little bridge season in between Interview with the Vampire seasons and accept that it's not going to be the best part. Uh, oh, here's a question. Did the season visually match the tone and genre it was aiming for? Well, if I could tell you what tone and genre it was aiming for, then I might be able to answer that question better. But when it did do violence and gore, it almost felt like a spy show, and I think that's kind of what they were going for. And when it did that, it did it well. It just didn't do that often. Someone asked, "Did the season make me want to keep watching future seasons?" And yes and no. No, because they should have done better. But honestly, I'm such a fan of Interview with the Vampire that nothing's gonna make me quit watching this franchise. But if we were suddenly getting more Talamasca than we were getting Interview with the Vampire, then that would be a different conversation. Oh, then here's kind of the central question. Someone asked, did this first season feel like a complete story or just setup? This whole season felt like setup. It felt like this was the pilot, and anything we get after is actually the show. So, how could the show better realize its central premise? By actually giving us everything it kept hinting at and hinting at all the way up to the finale. Give us that, supernatural horror spy show, because that's what it was supposed to be, I think. Oh, here's a good question. Did the show give us enough information about how the Talamasca actually functions? Sometimes it did, but otherwise, I feel like I still really couldn't tell you much about how the Talamasca works outside of what I know from the books. And honestly, it feels like the books told me more than this season of television all about them actually did. But we got the important bits. We understand the idea of the mother houses. We understand the idea that they're separate. We understand that they hypothetically, not really, uh, watch and don't interfere. Oh, here's a question. Someone asked me if I think the writers held Guy and his actor Nicholas Denton back by making him intentionally clueless. And I think that In the first few episodes, that could have been okay, but we got to the end of the season and he still felt clueless. We still felt like he has no idea what he's doing. Like he's coming into his mind reading abilities, but he's not really coming into how to navigate this world effectively. At least I didn't get the sense that he did. He kind of showed off to Helen by tailing her that he kind of knows the basics of spycraft, but that doesn't mean that he's going to make good decisions. But I hope he does. Like I hope he's written as a compelling protagonist, and that means he can't be a dumb protagonist. Someone asked if Helen's storyline was satisfying, undercooked, or confusing. I do think they could have given us more about her storyline earlier in the season than they did. I think the idea of her seeking her twin is interesting. The fact that we only get that in the last episode, it's like it's too much all for the last 10 minutes of a show. That should have been earlier. So much should have been earlier. And it's not that I don't love a good mystery, I do, but if you're going to have a 6 episode season, you write like a 6 episode season. You don't pretend that you have 16 episodes when you don't. Someone asked which cliffhanger makes me actually want season two. And honestly, the reveal of what Doris is feels like that could be really at the core of a more interesting Talamasca show. Someone asked if this series deepens the overall Immortal Universe lore. That is actually something I think the show did really well. The idea of the Talamasca using vampires to further their goals, the idea of vampires living these other sorts of lifestyles that we didn't specifically see in Interview with the Vampire or in the books or seeing other ways that witches live, that was fascinating. In that sense, the show is doing what I was hoping for. It's just that it didn't get a chance to do it enough. So someone else asked if the show maintains Anne Rice's sense of tragedy and moral ambiguity. That's another thing it did do well. I did feel sad for Helen and for Doris especially, and for Jasper and for Burton and even for Guy with his mother having gone missing. All of and with his mind reading abilities, they just needed to do more with it. But yes, that is one thing I will give them credit for. This does feel like an Anne Rice show, even if it is a different side of the Anne Rice world. The genre has shifted slightly to match it, but it does still feel like part of Interview with the Vampire, even if it is kind of a B plot. And so the last question I have here is how do I expect the show to connect to the Vampire Lestat next year? And that's kind of the big question, isn't it? The main thing I was hoping for from Talamasca, The Secret Order, was for it to be kind of a bridge show in between those seasons. And I do think that knowing more about the Talamasca, how they function, and having some more Talamasca characters to see could be a big part going of the story going into the Vampire Lestat, especially knowing that we're going to meet the Queen of the Damned later on, and that's going to be really where the Talamasca plays a much larger role in the story, at least if we're going by the books. Well, thank you all so much for joining me for this full season review of Telemasca the Secret Order. Even with the season's flaws, it's been fun theorizing about its future and seeing how it'll tie into the broader Immortal universe. So if you enjoyed this live stream, be sure to hit like, subscribe, and drop a comment afterward. And stick around, I'll be covering the Vampire Lestat the moment that show premieres. Until next time, we watch and we